very pointed comments and opinions. And now on to our next speaker, Chandran Nair. Now, Chandran Nair is the founder and chief executive of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT for short. That's an independent pan-Asian think tank with offices in Kuala Lumpur and Hong Kong. And they are focused on a deeper understanding of global issues, including the shift of economic and political influence from the West to Asia. And of course, the dynamic relationship between business and society and the reshaping of the rules of global capitalism. Chandran also sits in the executive committee of the Club of Rome, a distinguished global grouping of scientists, economists, business leaders, and former politicians who identify solutions to complex global issues, including to address planetary emergencies like climate change today. I should also mention that Chandran is a regular speaker at the World Economic Forum, APEC summits, OECD events, various UN conferences, and is also a member of the WEF's Global Agenda Council on Governance for Sustainability. Chandran, a very warm welcome. Thanks for talking to us. Now, let's begin with COP26, where already there seems to be hiccups in terms of, two of the world's biggest emitters in Russia and China not being present, and key national commitments to limiting warming not yet being met. Chandran, I'd like to ask you, and to kick off this discussion, how do you rate COP26, in fact, the COPs, as an ongoing solution to addressing climate change?
Morning, Chuang, and good morning to everyone. I don't know where to start. I listened to the first two speakers, and it was, I was going to say entertaining, but it was interesting. So maybe before I start to address your question, how I rate COPs, maybe I'll just say I don't do COPs, so I kind of don't rate it. But before I do that, maybe I could just say a couple of things from what I heard to put things in context as well. The last two speakers spoke a lot about certain things about valuing nature, etc. And then the second speaker, Ms. Rahman, also spoke about how net zeros and things like that are essentially fictitious and mythology creating. But we all fall to narratives. Even you, Chuang, who knows everything, fell victim to a narrative that has been spread. China is the world's biggest polluter. Well, that's a false narrative, right? China is the world's most populous country. Therefore, if Chinese have a right to essentially energy, better development, they will create more emissions. That's a fundamental understanding. And so narratives are very important, and we create these false narratives. We created a narrative that are about nature-based solutions. This too allows us to essentially seek refuge in nice things. And then the last speaker also spoke about, money, money, money. It's not really about money or nor technology. Can I put that bold statement out? It's really not about that. And I mean, certain countries are clearly in need of some assistance, but there's discussion that the solution is something about money, and the sort of rich North code for, Western white civilizations will save the other South, which is code for brown and black people, is such an old world kind of East India Company narrative. We need to change this narrative. So that's kind of what I want to say. So to your question about what do I think about COP? Well, if you've been watching the last 2 days, it seems to be, stage managed by all white guys. I mean, who in their right mind believes that Biden's got anything to say that he can actually do? I mean, supposedly he turns up as the most powerful man on the planet. He can't even get his own citizens to wear a mask. And who in their right minds actually thinks Boris Johnson is a serious person? So we need to really understand how these things play out. So yes, so yesterday there were two announcements, and your first speaker said, the whole deforestation by 2030. Well, that was actually a promise made in 2014, I think. And then there was the big methane thing, which Biden said, again, taking the stage to say America is going to lead. Well, if it's going to be methane by 20 to 30% reductions by a certain stage, he's going to have to fight a huge political battle with the fracking industry. And at the same time, as Biden's talking all this stuff about America is going to lead, what does Biden do the last few weeks? Tell the Saudi Arabians to pump more cheap oil so that they can essentially continue to live the American dream. So I think this is my point about this conversation you and I have, to kind of move away from we need more money and we need more technology. there are sort of simple things called nature-based solutions, and we don't have to worry about essentially the fundamental issue, which is what rights and freedoms do we have as in a crowded planet in the economies we live in, and therefore what can we consume, which is the pricing issue, which then plays into, of course, nature pricing ecosystem services, right? But you can't take these things in isolation. Fundamentally, you're going to have to understand, do you and I in a busy city like if you in KL have a right to a car? How many cars do we have a right to? What is the price of electricity and things like that? So those are the fundamental questions we need to ask. But you'll see, even with due respect to the professor from Harvard, the Harvard business model is not interested in asking the question about how do we price consumption, because its entire liberal economic narrative is about human beings should be able to consume whatever they are. In the American system, in the Western narrative, curbing consumption is essentially an infringement on civil liberties. But actually, we will not be able to consume. And that's actually the apex of the issue. And then we can talk about things like how do we price carbon and all this sort of mumbo jumbo about CDMs and offsetting and stuff like that. So what I think a COP26 means, same showboating, but I hope in this discussion, and you will lead me to it, we can talk about then what do we do in Malaysia? I'm interested in what we do in Asia at the country level, because, talking about finance, is Malaysia a poor country? No. Do we need money from the UK? Of course not. So we're still thinking like subservient, members of the Commonwealth, subservient to the East India Company kind of mentality. Malaysia is not a poor country. Are we stupid people? No. But what we do have is a broken political corrupt system that we need to fix before we can do anything about COP. So don't think about COP. Think about our country, and that applies to other countries as well. And that's why the Chinese model for me is a way to look at it. That's why Xi Jinping doesn't turn up. He's going to get all these Western guys bashing him. He's got better things to do at stay at home and fix stuff at home, which he can do because the political system is slightly different. So that's kind of where I wanted to set the scene, and hopefully you can moderate me so that I behave myself in terms of what I say.
Absolutely, Chandran. I mean, I think the Malaysia solution will still be top of the agenda. But before we get to that discussion, I think we have to further set the stage in terms of informing the argument that you have made many times in the past, that the Western solution is a very narrow solution because it focuses on the economics of the issue. You have said in the past that there's many types of capital which have been ignored by and large down the years. The most important of which is the pricing of natural capital. It's been a free ride, as you talk about. Air, water, soil, and so on and so forth, which has been extracted willy-nilly for free for many, many years. You've also talked in the past about human capital, which has been by and large ignored. And there's also, as a corollary of that, social capital, which then informs the whole discussion about politics and corruption and racism. So before we get to the Malaysia solution, and I see you smile there, Chandran, talk about how you've debunked the Thomas Piketty model of inequality, this discussion of inequality, where it's too narrow on economics and dismissive of the other types of capital.
Well, I mean, he wrote two very good books, and I don't want to, but my response to that, I think it was about 8-9 years ago, and I shared that link that was published in Yale, I think. My response to that was, and this is so typical, I think the dominant Western neoliberal economic model is one that people believe in religiously, right? Believe in religiously. The main advocates, the main speakers about things about economics, the new environmental challenge, etc., are Westerners. So this is an ideological struggle. So, even a conference like this, we start off with a Western guy to speak, just saying. Okay, so we always, who's never been to Malaysia, but just saying, right? So we are engrossed in this. Many of the Western economists, etc., just know one worldview, and it's understandable. They don't know the rest of the world. They don't understand. So even in the Club of Rome, which I'm a member of, the majority of members, very smart people, Americans, Europeans, etc., but the majority are essentially Westerners. They have such a strange worldview. They talk about esoteric economics, etc. So my debunking of that was Piketty's analysis using, analysis purely from the data from the West, and framing it around Western neoliberal economic frameworks. But countries like China operate very differently. So when we talk about, how we're going to finance things, I think the first professor also mentioned China has done a huge amount of reforestation projects, etc., by not borrowing money. They didn't look for the World Bank to send them money, and they didn't do trade-offs, etc., and offsets to get the money. They did it by essentially printing their own money. There are ways that which you can do this, and they mobilized it. And essentially, the value created through the reforestation was essentially put on the balance sheet as essentially through the value of the new forests created and the social impact. So you can, rather than have gold bars to back your currency, you can have forests and clean rivers as a way to also, in terms of local denominations, essentially legitimize your spending in terms of printing money. So that was my main thing. But your point about the other social capital, which I talked about, the other capital I talked about, the social capital, is institutions, right? I talk about institutions. Coming back to Malaysia, our institutions are broken because, and this is so related to everything we're talking about, even if we want to talk about the forests, right? Because we have a rent-seeking economy. We have a rent-seeking economy where elites, and particularly our dear Malay elites in Malaysia, think the country is theirs. And therefore, they can do anything they want with it. And the others should just operate within the Alibaba system. Your uncle will do the contract, and my brother-in-law will do the legal papers, if you see what I mean, the Malaysian context, right? So that's really the problem. We have a rent-seeking economy. So nothing is essentially protected. There's no legal frameworks. I think Datin asked a question to the American professor about accountability in terms of water rights, etc. I mean, that's such an important question, but it completely doesn't apply in Malaysia because everyone's off limits. I mean, the former prime minister got even convicted in court, and today he's walking around. There's no rule of law. So why does this apply? Why does this matter in terms of climate change and all the things we're talking about? Because we're going to need laws, and we're going to need draconian laws that are enforced. I'm not even talking yet about where we need to go. What does a one-car policy look like in the Klang Valley if we are to essentially get to what we need to do? It will not reduce quality of life. It will require a fundamental shift, but that's what we need to do. So you need institutions. And every day, you and I know as Malaysians, you will see reports about illegal incursions into forest land, dumping into rivers, etc. Everyone breaks the law, no rule of law. So the social capital is fundamental in a crowded planet if you want to protect natural capital and then essentially human capital. But if you don't have that, everything's broken.
Well, Chandran, given what appears to be an immovable edifice in the form of the political economy and the corporate structure in Malaysia, which tends to somehow align itself with the political economy as well, what wiggle room does Malaysia have? Maybe does it come from the private sector where individual corporations, which have a certain heft and size, make individual decisions about what to do, but about trying to move the needle on their own steam instead, rather than relying on policy from a government which doesn't necessarily have the environment at its core?
Well, just two points I'd like to make, right? At a global level and a policy level, sustainability, climate change are public and common goods. Companies don't do public and private goods. That doesn't make them bad people, but you can't ask Pizza Hut to sell less pizzas. Right? That's as simple as that. A Pizza Hut wants you to buy more pizzas, and they don't care if you get obese, fat, and ugly. They don't care, right? So the palm oil industry doesn't worry about, sustainability. It doesn't make them bad, but the palm oil industry's objective is to fill every goods in the supermarkets with a drop of palm oil, right? So that they can continue to expand. Other people working in the industry, bad people? No, that's not what I mean. But that is the capitalist economy exported around the world. So Pizza Hut doesn't sell less pizzas. Pizza Hut's role is to get you to eat as many pizzas as you can. Only the state can then say, hey, Pizza Hut, we got a problem with your cheese. Because your cheese is creating an explosion of certain diseases, etc., are we going to regulate, right? So that is very important to understand. Companies don't do sustainability. And I outlined that in my second book, but company can, and usually under duress and regulation, and Malaysia there's few and far between, who follow every law and principle. You know, I did a talk about 10 years ago to a bunch of CEOs from listed companies in KL, private, and I asked them, so how many of you can put up your hands and say that you essentially meet every environmental regulation, you pay your taxes, and you actually follow every labor law, etc.? Nobody put down their hands, because we all know that is the modus operandi, right? So that's one thing you need to understand. So as soon as the social values in the society get corrupted, then this idea of climate change, etc., becomes challenging them, becomes fictitious. But then to your point about, you know, can companies do certain things? Of course they can. They can do certain things, but they have to take leadership role. And that is a huge call, right? Leadership role. They have to challenge various things. In Malaysia, have you seen a single corporate leader take a position on the things challenging our country? So in fact, 3 weeks ago, I wrote a piece saying corporate Malaysia. In my view, if you want to change things in Malaysia, and it is an oblique route to talk about the things we're talking, first, you need to essentially challenge the race-based racist system, because that's where the rent-seeking starts, right? Now, has any corporate Malaysia spoken up about racism in Malaysia? No. So they are complicit. So if you can't even address the fundamentals of governance structure and the institutional issues, how are you going to change climate change? How are you going to address climate change? How are you going to save the forests in Balloon? How are you going to talk about even making sure that something like the Klang River water supply system works? Because then you have to say, hey, how come with so many incompetent people in so many important positions? You got to make people accountable. You got to fire them irrespective of race. And that's the fundamental point about institutional issues to address these existential threats of our time. And therefore, if you expand it on a global level, then I say, you know, when we look at COP, I think there's like 190 countries or something. I didn't even know there were 190 countries. I thought it was 160 something. But there's, you know, everyone goes there because, you know, it's a nice festival. You can all go there. But the serious people like, you know, Putin and Xi said, okay, well, let's see what happens. We got to solve problems. But the point I'm trying to say is 60% of all emissions are between 3 economic regions, right? 2 countries and an economic region. The United States is the EU and China. Per capita, China is the lowest. So we don't need to bring 190 people and, you know, create all this circus, right? But it's a good circus for the British and the French to have, because it shows they're saving the world. And then you start talking about stuff like, let's save the rainforests of the world. And if you saw what the professor showed in terms of the 3 forest regions, nothing in Canada, nothing in the USA. It's all, you know, Congo, there's Brazil, and there is Southeast Asia. You know, all those countries badly managed, and my God, they need to step up. That doesn't mean I'm saying we shouldn't step up, but these international agreements are kind of Western politicians, you know, hogging the stage and deflecting issues. And then we fall into the trap in thinking they're going to help us. They're not. So we in Malaysia coming back, we're not poor. We're a rich country plundered by our elites. We have enough money. I mean, look at our budget. Did you see much about mitigation on climate? I didn't read the whole thing because, you know, it's too kind of silly to even read it, but there's not much stuff there. And then there's some allocation to, you know, people wanting to do sustainable SMEs and something to do with nature protection. We don't even have the institutions to enable people to define what the criteria is, how to distribute the money. And if one is really cynical, you know, that's another channel for giving money to my friends. And it usually starts with, let's look at the Bumiputra smallholders and the Bumiputra nature lovers to get the money first. This is racist-based nonsense, right? So we have to change the whole structure of thinking about how we're going to deal with Malaysia's existential threats in relation to climate and resource management. Institutions first.
Well, even as we speak, Chandran, my neighborhood is going through another water disruption.
I know, 5 this year.
Which seems incredulous because water falls from the sky almost every day at this time of year. So in order to get constructive and instructional about the Malaysia situation, we are well aware in this country of the impediments to progress, shall we say, right, which you've outlined in great detail in the last half an hour. What can we do? What is the Malaysia solution in terms of just being able to take control and be a little bit proactive, if not on an individual level, at a corporate level?
Well, I'm aware that, there's a tendency to think of what I've outlined as being negative. But I say this all around the world. If you don't confront the realities, then you seek appeasement and seduction in sort of Mickey Mouse ideas, right? But I understand people want solutions. But to start, I will go back to what I said. If you don't change the institutional frameworks in Malaysia, nothing can change because it's corrupt. Now, then can the corporations do something? And as I've argued, I think the corporations in Malaysia are complicit in this because of the race-based, non-meritocracy-based system we have, right? From the GLCs right through. Are there great Malaysian companies? Yes, there are. But they are all essentially also stuck in not being able to speak out. And I know many but we need leadership. So the first point to your question, there's no substitute for leadership. Sorry, there's no technological fix. There's no finance fix. You can have a lot of money, bad leadership, you have one NDV, right? So you need, but can companies do something? If there is leadership, there are many things they could do. For instance, first things first, look at all your operations, all the companies listed on the Bursa, and ask yourself 3 questions. The first one, have you followed every environmental law in the company? Have you followed everyone? This is simple stuff. I'm not even talking about sustainability because sustainability and environment are 2 different things. I'm happy to explain it. Have we followed it and put a report out? You don't need to do this ESG kind of smokescreen nonsense, right? You can do something very simple and you don't need to get one of the big 4 who is just basically cover up your nonsense. That's what they get paid for, big fees. And you don't need one of the McKinsey guys. You can get some Malaysians to do this as long as you allow them access to all your data, right? That first one. Second one, have we essentially upheld all our fiduciary responsibilities in terms of obligations and in terms of our license to operate, including our governance structure, right? Have we done that? That includes, of course, also things like, do we have a proper racial mixture in the boards, all of that? And we'll find out that most don't. The third thing then is, do we employ and meet all the labor laws? And the fourth element to that is, if we have done all of that, to your point, where do we go next, given the challenge we face, right? Where do we go next? What do we improve? So for instance, if you're a palm oil company, are you certain that every bit of your operations throughout the country essentially have not been involved in open burning, wastewater treatment, which can be zero discharge? So I come from a bioscience engineering background, zero discharge, right? Are you certain? Third, do you employ any illegal labor, and do you underpay your labor? And what's your land management like? What is your biodiversity record? So all of us can do these things, right? So that's where I think it starts, but it requires leadership at the corporate level. It requires boards that hold, CEOs responsible. I've seen very few of these. So that's where, and I can go on about floods, food supply issues. What are we doing about rising seas, biodiversity? That's a public policy areas, and also looking at the urban heating effects, right? So there's so many things companies can do, but you start by asking yourself those 3 questions. And if you can't answer those things in 3 weeks, you got a big problem. So and then put it out in the public domain. Tell us what you do. But don't employ the big guys, because they'll cut and slice and dice it, and before you know it, it's an ESG report, and then it's just mumbo jumbo.
Well, in response to the questions you asked, Chandran, I think we kind of, by and large, know the answer to those questions, because we don't have the enforcement, nor do we have the institutional enforcement of those policies. So what happens next?
So we know that. But to your point, can companies do something? It doesn't matter if there's no enforcement. Am I going to do something only because I'm afraid the policeman will catch me? No, I do it because that is the law. But beyond the law, I am a responsible leader. That is a fundamental shift that we have to take. And I'm not even asking, suggesting we go into the other realm of sustainability, which requires fundamental shifts in business models, right? And that's some of the work we're doing with various companies around the world. In Malaysia, forget the enforcement. Forget why do you need enforcement to follow the law? The law is essentially enforced to make sure that enough people, and there are always enough people who will break it deliberately, are caught and set as examples. But if you're a CEO of a GLC, a listed company, my God, do you need enforcement?
Well, exactly. That's the point. Last question before we close for the morning, Chandran. Is there a business model to be, or can business models evolve to coalesce with basically environmental destruction, so that at least corporations can respond accordingly with their profit motive in mind? To obviously close the discussion on a positive note, maybe.
Yeah, I'm very positive. I'm very positive about calling out the truth and then saying to people, okay, stand up and lead. Okay, everything else is hocus pocus. So to your point, are there examples? There are examples, but it does require fundamental business changes. So for instance, let me give you one example. There's a company that's involved in large scale production of fast food that's involves chickens. A couple of guesses, okay. So most of that chicken, as you know, is chlorinated, chemicalized, etc. But some people like them, whatever turns you on. But that's a business model. But you don't have a right to a business. So this is the profit. This is the thing. Keep their profits going. No, my friends. You don't have a right to a profit if the externalities of that is social costs that is too high. Then who decides if that social cost is too high? Only the state, right? So this is why, to my point about rules. But if the state is weak, then businesses need to do something. And if you're committed to this agenda, then you have to take action. So in terms of industrial chicken, just looking at our country, Malaysia, you could do a lot by essentially creating employment, using denuded land, reactivating agricultural land, by producing a network of thousands of farmers who produce essentially natural fed compound-based chickens according to very good standards, and then you create a supply chain. But about 50 years ago, the great Americans invented industrial meat, and then we had KFC, right? So that's what it's called. So if you still like KFC, well, let's make it people-based, community-based. You can create an incredible system of essentially empowering rural people to grow chickens in sustainable ways, et cetera, that produce that. So there are many examples, but you need competence. So in companies, I feel there's a CSR department, which has got nothing to do with anything real apart from, sort of hocus pocus. But then there's a sustainability thing that no one listens to. So you have to build science-based technical competence in companies. But fundamentally, you need your leaders to say, I want to do this. I'm taking us from industrial chickens to a different form. I'm reducing the carbon footprint. I'm going to protect biodiversity. And the feed material will come from local sources, and we will grow it in this way, and we will employ, hundreds of thousands of people, completely reframing all of that. And then you need the governments to essentially be partners in incentivizing those kinds of